Okay, we are up to topic 4.10, the Second Great Awakening. Yes, Second Great Awakening, because of course we've already seen the first one back in the colonial times. Let's get into our topic. So our question today is, what were the causes and effects of the Second Great Awakening? And obviously, we need to just take a brief moment to think back to the original Great Awakening during the colonial times. People like Jonathan Edwards, in his fiery sermons, awakening people to their straying from their religious path and trying to kind of revive the American religious beliefs. And we're going to see a lot of that same thing with the Second Great Awakening. It's starting about 1800 or so in the very early days of the Republic. Religion had been becoming more liberal and more sort of a little looser, a little more accepting of things that had not been accepted in the past. There's also the Enlightenment that's dominant at this time period, and religion was never a big focus of the Enlightenment. Enlightenment thinkers have been often skeptical of religion. They're focused more on the science of the world, not faith. If they can't see it, they don't believe it, kind of thing. And so if you have a situation that all those things are sort of churning about, it's time for a revival. And we can point to one area in particular that's seen as kind of the birth of the Second Great Awakening. This would be the so-called burned over district of Western New York State. You're going to see all kinds of different beliefs and teachings popping up, spreading like wildfire across the state. This revival just catches on, and thousands of people are swept up in this revival. Now, as we look at our map, here's the burned over district where, again, this Second Great Awakening is going to begin. You'll notice that the Second Great Awakening begins to spread all across America. And you'll also notice what's helping it spread, and that, of course, would be railroads and canals. So all that new transportation stuff we've been talking about in period 4, here we are looking at a great example of how it is leading to social changes. It's spreading the faith. Now here is a typical Second Great Awakening meeting, and we're looking at this picture. Okay, what does this tell us? Well, it tells us these things were well attended. It tells us that they were held outside because they're so big no single church could hold it. It tells us it's a mix of different people. It tells us also it's a very emotional time, that people are really transfixed by the message. So these camp meetings, as they were called, were, fiery preachers would arrive in town, and they would set up shop, and they would give messages and sermons, and they would pray with people. And it was just intensely emotional. Crowds would be just almost entranced by the speaker. People would be shouting, just bawling tears, convulsing and shaking, talking and speaking in tongues. Just deep emotionalism is something we really point to with the Second Great Awakening. Now, if you look at the chart, you'll see that the effect of the Second Great Awakening is massive. I mean, the number of denominations and church membership just takes off, right? You can see Baptists and Methodists in particular. They're literally breaking the chart. They're growing so quickly here. But even other groups are going to grow, just maybe not quite in the same amount as Baptists and Methodists. But the point is, it's a massive religious experience. It's spreading across America. Now, if you recall in our first Great Awakening, we looked at Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield as kind of like the two prime speakers. For this one, we're going to look at a guy named Charles Grandison Finney. So when you're thinking of the Second Great Awakening, remember his name. Like Jonathan Edwards and others from the First Great Awakening, Charles Grandison Finney was a great speaker. He was great at holding the crowd kind of the palm of his hand. He appealed to people's fear of being sent to hell. So, you've got to get right with God right now, that the only thing that's saving you is with faith and hard work. He also speaks out against the use of alcohol, and he speaks out against slavery, and he encourages women to pray openly and participate fully in the church. So he is really hitting all the bases here. And again, deep emotion runs through this guy and his messages. So remember the cult of domesticity, and we learned that the cult of domesticity in particular had applied most closely to the middle class, right? The middle class. Well, what we're going to see is middle-class women were the ones who made up the majority of the new church members. So if you're looking at the Second Great Awakening, it doesn't affect everyone equally. It hits women probably the hardest, particularly middle-class women. And what they were doing is they saw this as an opportunity to bring God back into the home. The thought would be that their husband and their children would be brought back to God through their example. And they're going to be the ones who are really pushing for and leading a lot of these reform movements. And the picture here I know is very dramatic, but remember, this is a time period where men had total control over their families. Things like domestic abuse, that was not even a term they would have used back then. And so women are hoping that maybe through God and through their religious actions, they can kind of tame their husband and bring him back to the faith and provide a better family for the children. All right, now we're going to look at a particular branch of religion here, of Christianity, that's going to be born during this time period from the Second Great Awakening that's still very much with us. It's called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, more familiarly known as simply the Mormons. So, us here in Clarksville, we don't have a very large Mormon population. As you can see, we're only, single digits basically percentage. But if you were to go out west in places like Utah and Idaho and even parts of Nevada, you would notice a very large Mormon population. So let's try to figure out where this religion started. And it begins with a guy named Joseph Smith. So Joseph Smith was from the Burned Out District. And remember, the Burned Out District in New York is where a lot of these religious movements got started, where the Second Great Awakening itself got started. And according to Mormon teachings, in 1830, he was basically approached by an angel. And this angel gave him these golden tablets, these golden plates. And then Joseph Smith translates these golden plates. And what he translated was the teachings of the Mormon Church, known as the Book of Mormon. And so there's a picture of him doing the translations, reading over them, and so forth. And this new fledgling faith, the Mormon faith, got a lot of criticism. Outsiders were suspicious. I mean, anytime someone says they've been visited by an angel and they have these new revelations from God, they're going to get a bit of skepticism, right? They're going to get kind of people are going to look at them a little funny. Other things that bothered some people is that the Mormons tended to kind of work together as a group, as a community. They were kind of secretive. They were not a community that necessarily interacted heavily with the outside world, at least in the early days. They kind of kept it themselves. But by far, the biggest complaint people had was polygamy. So in the early days of the Mormon Church, polygamy was pretty open and pretty accepted. Smith himself had over 24 wives. And so outsiders basically gave the Mormons a hard time, chased them away basically, and the Mormons start heading west looking for refuge. And in 1844, Joseph Smith is murdered by a mob in Illinois. And there's Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, murdered. Now, in other cases, in other faiths and so forth, that might result in kind of the community breaking down and just kind of the end of the faith. But a man steps into the shoes of Joseph Smith named Brigham Young. And Brigham Young was a great organizer. He was a great speaker. He was a guy who just had a lot of faith and pull in the community. And he's going to lead the Mormons west, and I mean way out west, out eventually to Utah, where they could basically survive on their own, prosper, and kind of just live outside of established communities that were always looking to attack the Mormons. And so you can see the path that the Mormons are going to take. It's known as the Mormon Trail, heading out west and eventually to the Great Salt Lake area. Now, what plagues the Mormons, though, again, is this acceptance of polygamy. And you can see this political cartoon here criticizing Brigham Young on his death, showing this very large bed full of his wives who are sad that he's passed. And in fact, concerns over polygamy kept Utah from becoming a state until 1896. They easily could have qualified for statehood way before that, but the government was very reluctant to accept them until the turn of the century. Now, if you look at the state of Utah today, you can see Mormons are still the majority in many of the counties. In fact, in some counties of the state, you are talking 80+% of Mormon faith. So that's a great example of a permanent legacy of the Second Great Awakening. All right, so Second Great Awakening, guys, this huge revival we talked about began in the burned out district in the early 1800s. We looked at its effect. We looked at its spread of the camp meetings and emotionalism. We looked at the birth of the Mormon faith. And again, this is evidence that that America is rapidly changing in the first half of the 1800s.